Ben's memoir was called A Good Life, and the late Katharine Graham, when she wrote her autobiography, which won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, was such a brilliant book. Ben asked her what she was going to call it, and she said, A Better Life, although that was not the final title. I feel like a time traveler from another era of journalism, from the pre-digital era of journalism, but I've been working hard trying to move into the digital age in my studies about the future of journalism, which I do a lot of research and writing about. And to answer since I'm the first panelist, perhaps I'll give the first answer to the question for today's conference: can journalism be trusted in the digital age? And my answer is yes, if it's journalism based on credible original reporting, and if that journalism survives and adapts to the digital age in both reporting and dissemination of the news. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that as I go through what's going on in the United States. In America, which is obviously a large country with an awful lot of media of a variety of kinds, even before the digital age, and now with much more variety of media than ever, and obviously with international reach and international media coming into the United States. You'll hear later from a person who works for the Guardian in the United States, which is now just as much a presence in the United States as any locally based media. There's this incredible, rapid transformation of journalism going on, and there's no end of it in sight. I talk about it as an ecosystem because it is just as lively and changeable as the ecosystem all around us in life. Things are being born every day, new media are being born every day, old media are dying or struggling to stay alive every day, and things are constantly shifting within that ecosystem. So I think one of the mistakes that's sometimes made about academic study of the future of journalism is to impose the old patterns where everything stayed the same for decades and decades of essentially advertising supported media in the United States into this new world. And there used to be a single economic model. There's no single economic model anymore. There used to be a single audience model, which by and large was a monopoly within the cities around the United States for newspapers and local television stations, and nationally for 3 or 4 large national networks. That model, there's no single model anymore. So these arguments over things like, should there be a paywall model or not a paywall model, to me are missing the point, because there are going to be different models and different solutions and different ways of doing things and different innovations for all the different kinds of media that are around us. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that. I try to draw a distinction in the beginning of my remarks here about credible original reporting from all the other kinds of communications that now take place in the digital world, all of which are valuable. All of the social media conversations that are going on, all the opinions that are available on the internet, and so on, are all fine. But so much of what is necessary for those conversations to take place still comes from credible original reporting from professional news media organizations, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And by the way, I define that very largely. Individual bloggers who are credible original reporters are professional news organizations just as much as the Washington Post is. So the reconstruction that's going on, as you know, what's been happening in the commercial media. Audiences have fragmented through digital dissemination. There's been, older media have been repurposing content in a variety of ways. Other people have been repurposing our content for free, which undermines the economic model. When you can find essentially summaries of Washington Post stories, for example, all kinds of places on the internet, why would you pay to come to the Washington Post? And if you come to the Washington Post website for free, why would you ever want to pay for it in the future? And so there's a seeking of new kinds of economic models by these old media organizations. Things like paywalls, new kinds of advertising, new digital products like guides to dining, entertainment, sports, and so on. All the things that have grown up as new things on the web are also being tried by commercial journalism organizations to compete, and most prevalently and most destructively cost-cutting. In order to stay profitable, or even in many cases to stay alive, so many American news organizations are engaged in cost-cutting that also affects news reporting, because there's been a lot of cost-cutting in newsrooms all across the country. There's also a changing ownership patterns of media in the United States. Most news media had been owned by large corporations that own many newspapers, many television stations. and that is breaking down as those news organizations' economic models collapse. So Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest men, has been buying up newspapers of a certain kind in the United States, those that are still monopolies. It may be hard to understand here how many newspapers in the United States are still monopolies in their local communities. There's no Craigslist in many of these communities around the country. The nearest television station's at a big city some distance away. So ranging from towns to small cities, many of these newspapers are still monopolies. They put up paywalls in order to force you to continue to subscribe to the newspaper to read it online. They don't care if anybody comes just online because they're a local monopoly still for news and for advertising. Those are the papers he's buying. They're still profitable. They're still throwing off cash. I don't know how long they're going to survive, and I don't know how altruistic Warren Buffett may be in buying them against the day when they won't be as profitable as they are now. There are entrepreneurial change agents who are beginning to buy major American media organizations, and obviously the most noteworthy one is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who has bought the Washington Post. And I'll come back and talk a little bit about that. But he's bought this newspaper because he wants it to survive. He wants its news coverage to survive and prosper, but he knows he's going to have to be innovative in the distribution and economic models in order for it to be profitable in the future. And that's why he's bought it, because he thinks he can do that. Or somebody named Aaron Kushner, who's bought the newspaper in Orange County, California, a huge suburban area south of California, who's done exactly the opposite of what most other newspaper owners have done in the country. He's investing in all kinds of additional local reporting. He's hiring people right and left, and we'll have to see how that works out. There are new kinds of consolidators. There are companies we've never heard of before, investment companies that are beginning to buy up distressed television stations, radio stations, and so on, and newspapers around the country. And then, of course, there are the digital startups, the for-profit digital startups, like Politico, for example, headquartered in Washington, that specializes in political coverage, or the Huffington Post, which I'm sure you're familiar with here. Those older news organizations that are going to survive, that are going to be able to continue to produce this original, credible reporting, have to change the way in which they have to change the nature of their organization. So, for instance, while we still call the Washington Post a newspaper, it's not a newspaper anymore. We are a multimedia, multi-platform news organization. Our newsroom is in the middle of our newsroom is a hub that we call the Universal News Desk that serves all of our websites, all of our mobile applications, as well as a print newspaper. Our audience on the web is far vaster than our audience in print. However, the income is not anywhere near, from that audience in the web, is not anywhere near the income we still get in printed advertising. So it would be foolish to close down the printed newspaper. Jeff Bezos has emphasized that, because it still not only serves a local audience effectively, more than 500,000 circulation every day in the Washington area, but it still brings in hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising in print every day in the printed newspaper. So you have to try and figure out how this economic model has to change. The growth areas of our staff in the newsroom, after we've had to cut back on a lot of the print areas, the growth areas in our newsroom are things like online and particularly television. We now have 50 people producing television of various kinds, video of various kinds in our newsroom. Programs of varying lengths, snippets of things, longer programs, all of which right now appear on our website. But I think at some point, if I were Jeff Bezos, I'd be wondering, how can we be selling that to other video outlets? When will the day come when you no longer watch television separately from your computer, as many young people already watch it primarily in their computer? So, for instance, I think that newspapers that become fully multimedia news organizations will be very formidable competitors to local television stations in the United States, because our news staffs are larger for covering local news. At the same time, there's grown up in the United States in this new ecosystem a large number of nonprofit news organizations, and their numbers are growing every day. They're mostly small operations. They mostly have been begun by journalists who left older news media. In many cases, they're investigative reporting sites because they've been started by investigative journalists who wanted to keep investigative journalism robust at a time when all these cuts were taking place in newsrooms around the country. Some of them are centered in universities, which I'll come back to in a minute. Others are freestanding. So examples, for instance, are Nationally ProPublica, headquartered in New York, the Center for Investigative Reporting, headquartered in California, which have relatively large staffs for these nonprofits because they have big financial backers, big foundations, and donors of various kinds. There are state and local ones, like the Texas Tribune in Texas, the Voice of San Diego in San Diego, the St. Louis Beacon in St. Louis, Missouri, the Min Post in Minneapolis, Minnesota, others that are all around the country at state and local levels, and they are filling a void because, again, as these cuts took place in local news organizations, they no longer had the wherewithal to cover the state capitals the way they did before, or even to cover City Hall as thoroughly as they did before. And as a result, these startups are focusing on government and public affairs reporting, and that's the way in which they are being funded by foundations and donors who are worried about the dearth of this kind of coverage in the future if they didn't start these nonprofits. But their economic models are shaky because they're started by and large with foundation grants or a local benefactor who cannot fund them forever in the future. It's not like a steady stream of advertising revenue. And so they have to constantly be trying to find new ways to raise funds. They offer memberships to people who want to donate money to be a member of that news organization. They do other kinds of local fundraising, and they are beginning to approach businesses for sponsorships and advertising, even though they're nonprofits. They collaborate with commercial media. This is one of the most important things about these nonprofits and their relationship to the commercial media. They are able to cover news that the commercial media can no longer cover, and as a result, for instance, the New York Times and the Washington Post have published news stories for ProPublica, the investigative reporting, national investigative reporting nonprofit in New York, because as much investigative reporting as we continue to do at the Post, it's not as much as we used to be able to do. ProPublica has these great investigative journalists, so we know that they're credible, we know who they are, we publish their stories. As a result, the audiences for these nonprofits are much larger than their own websites because they're publishing in commercial news organizations. Commercial news organizations are benefiting from getting journalism that they cannot necessarily afford to produce by themselves. In addition to that, we do have a public broadcasting sphere in the United States, but it's very different from Britain or Ireland. There's no completely government subsidized public broadcasting in the United States. Instead, the federal government provides a small amount of money, a relatively small amount of money for public broadcasting through something called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Individual nonprofit stations, public stations around the country, radio and television, and national organizations like National Public Radio get some of that money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but it's a minority, in some cases a very small minority of their total income. The rest has to be raised, like all the other nonprofits, through memberships and fundraising and foundation grants and large donors of various kinds. The public television stations, by and large, do not produce very much news. There's one national news program, and there are various documentaries that are funded at various television stations around the country, public stations, that are then shown nationally on PBS. But no really original reporting takes place on public broadcasting except for a few public television stations around the country. On the other hand, public radio has become an increasingly important player in the production of original, credible journalism in the United States. NPR is a very strong news organization whose audience is growing every year and become quite large and influential nationally. And the member stations who actually pay for NPR, because it's a kind of a cooperative. A number of them are becoming increasingly active in covering local news around the country and are banding together in various kinds of collaborations with each other and with commercial news media and with nonprofits to do more and more of that reporting. So that's an important role, I think, for the future of American journalism. And finally, there's one other player, and that's universities. And Arizona State is a very good example of it. It's one of the leaders in which we are producing professional level journalism that is used by commercial news organizations all around the state of Arizona and in some cases nationally. So for instance, there's a state news bureau, the Cronkite News Service is a state news bureau that covers the capital of Arizona, covers state issues for newspapers and television stations all around Arizona. It also has the only Washington bureau for all of Arizona, all of its newspapers and television stations. None of them have their own Washington bureau anymore. So the Cronkite News Service Washington Bureau serves them. which means that student reporters working under the leadership of professional journalists who are now in the Cronkite faculty are producing this kind of coverage that normally would have been produced by professional news organizations in the past. It also does various kinds of in-depth and investigative reporting projects, one of which I direct called News 21, which is actually a national investigative reporting project in which students from the Cronkite School and other students selected from universities around the country participate in a teleconference seminar I conduct from January through April of each year out of Phoenix. And we pick a topic. Last year it was voting rights. This year it was the returning veterans from the two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq who are not being well served by the country on their return. And I organize these students into reporting teams around the country. We use the seminar to have mass interviews of experts and advocates in whatever subject it is we're talking about. And this past summer, and then they come together in a summer newsroom at the Cronkite School with a stipend that it's paid for them by a foundation that supports the project, the Knight Foundation. And they produced this summer 26 stories and 60 multimedia pieces, all of which are on the website for News 21 this summer. If you want to look at it, it's called backhome.news21.com. It's a remarkable website. Everything you see on it was produced by students with faculty assistants. The design of the website, there's a lot of very innovative multimedia on it, all done by the students. And we have publishing partners around the country. A number of newspapers led by the Washington Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer publish stories from the project. NBCnews.com puts stories and multimedia from it up on its website. Many websites around the country, both commercial and nonprofit, use the material. The work of these students is probably seen by several million people each year around the United States. Other universities are beginning to do this. There are other state news bureaus run by state universities. I believe this is going to be an increasingly important source of news coverage in the United States. So no single model is going to work. No single revenue source is going to be the solution to this, no silver bullet. Instead, it's going to be a combination of all these different things going on. Some will fail, some will prosper, others will come and go. But what matters most to me, I think, on the web is brands. When first people were first seeing a lot of information on the web, everybody thought, or at least some of the thinkers thought, brands would not matter anymore because we're all journalists now. But in fact, we find from traffic and from links and from all the citations on sites everywhere that brands do matter. That people come to the Washington Post for a certain kind of coverage, they go to the Guardian for certain kinds of coverage, even if it's only through links through other websites that they regularly use. And so the credibility of the brand is going to be very important in this new ecosystem.
Thank you, Len. That was really interesting.